Welcome to episode 225, Holding Space in Divisive Times, Managing Sociopolitical Stress to Prevent Burnout and Stay Purposeful in Therapy, featuring Dr. Dain Kloner, licensed marriage and family therapist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I have invited my dear colleague, Dr. Dain Kloner, to join me. As we sit here recording this episode, it is mere hours from the determination of the recent presidential election in the United States. And I am so grateful to Dain. He has been on our show before. He's an expert in burnout and compassion fatigue and how we therapists also manage being humans. And I'm so grateful to Dain for coming on today and talking with us. Thank you, Dain.
Yeah, of course.
There's so much feeling right now. Before we dive into the topics that we're going to discuss today, I would love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about you and about your background, and then we will just dive into this, just very small, unimportant topic.
I've been in private practice now for 7-8 years, and I've worked a lot with complex trauma, so more than one trauma, and traumas of all kinds, and also worked with PTSD. And as we know, that everybody has relative trauma, but not everybody has PTSD. And a lot of times, what we don't think about is how we're impacted by society. We always think about it in terms of personal trauma, right? Things that have happened directly to us, but we don't think about sometimes how we're indirectly influenced. And that's a difficult concept sometimes, because once I bring that into session and we talk about the macro things, people are really actually surprised. Wow, I didn't think about how that affected me, right? And a sociopolitical climate, these are the things that intensify compassion fatigue and burnout, for sure, especially among therapists and other helping professions. But a challenging political climate, as an example, is something that I have seen affect, quite literally over the last 8 years, has been something that's affected us considerably. I know that in 2020, during the potential re-election, during that week, my practice increased by nearly 30% because of the anxiety that was going through and how people were being triggered in their trauma, or how they were thinking about things that were affecting them or how it might affect them.
As a field, many studies, many surveys have shown that the majority of clinicians identify as quote unquote liberal, identify as progressive. We know this about the field of psychology. This does not include all therapists. And the reason I bring this up is because we have a field right now that has been divided, that is very divided in the way that we feel today. The way we feel today may be profoundly different than the way our colleague, who's a dear social worker, is sitting, just across the hallway from us. They may feel very differently about this. Today's conversation is not to say how any therapist needs to feel. Today's conversation is about how we take care of ourselves and how we navigate an unbelievably polarized environment, and how we stay true to these ideas that float through therapy about doing no harm to our clients. How do we balance this? How do we take care of ourselves and also care for our clients? To speak openly about where I'm at, I am an out queer woman in a multiracial family. I am tasked with holding space for a caseload who has the potential to be profoundly affected by the sociopolitical climate and already has been. That said, I have clients who feel differently about these issues than I do. I think many, if not most, if not all of us do. And I think that's part of the conversation today is trying to remember that guiding light of service. You mentioned something, Dain, and I want to start there. Burnout. When we are in times like this where the stakes are so high, the anxiety, the fear, the anger, so much emotion, how can therapists recognize the signs of burnout, especially when some of these things feel so personal and overwhelming, not just for our caseloads, but for ourselves?
I've talked to a number of therapists, personal friends and colleagues, and they've acknowledged feeling, just the anticipation of this political climate has made people feel disheartened, distressed. And of course, it's due to polarized social issues, policy changes affecting clients, personal stressors, of course, linked to their own political viewpoints. And having to balance that almost takes an extra set of gills, for breathing that stuff in. And burnout comes in a lot of different forms. And I think one of the things that, because it's so impactful, we forget that it's just another element that weighs on us if we break it down, right? It's important. It's extremely important. And at the same time, I feel as though it's just another thing as therapists we need to be aware of, right? On a micro and a macro level. How does it affect me? How do my values come through? How do I keep them in check? How do I support somebody whose viewpoints are different from my own? We all experience the burnout of emotional exhaustion. There's a sense that some things that we don't feel like ourselves. There's depersonalization. Sometimes we feel like we have to talk. How about this? Sometimes feel like we have to talk about politics in the first place. So then we feel like there's an imposter syndrome if we don't know what we're talking about, or what if we're sharing too much? We're disclosing too much in session. So that can lead to cynicism. That can lead to a heightened stress response. That can lead to self-doubt, loss of empathy, right? And so we're not taking care of ourselves the same way because these things are so emotionally charged. Recognizing and addressing these symptoms early is pretty crucial, obviously, depending on the rapport that you have with your client. Some people report that they will talk to their clients about political issues. In fact, there is, and let me cite my research, there is the National Library of Medicine. There's an article in this era. We've seen more divisiveness. We've seen more anxiety. It's literally in the research. And a lot of therapists, 87%, reported, and this was done by Solomonov and Barber back in 2019. And they acknowledged that 87% of therapists reported that they discussed politics in session, and 63% reported political self-disclosure. Therapists who perceived political similarity with most patients were more likely to report political discussions than self-disclosure. What was most interesting is that therapists who reported shared political views with a higher percentage of patients, and those who explicitly disclosed also reported stronger alliances. And they had put in this research that Clinton supporters, in particular, reported significant observed pre-election, post-election increases in political discussions, increases in patients' expression of negative emotions, and decreases in positive emotions. Trump supporters reported the opposite phenomenon. I find that fascinating.
These are the situations where I feel like we're walking this clinical tightrope, potentially, between quote unquote neutrality, not making the therapy about us. Like, that's not what we're there for. Then also this idea of wanting to join with our clients, and where the tightrope is this phenomenon that I call, and maybe other folks have called, like overjoining. And then also on the other side of that, to cast aside someone else's feeling about it if it doesn't align with ours. So someone who may walk into therapy next week happy as a clam, and we haven't been sleeping well for a week, or vice versa. And like how do we not overjoin with the clients that we share perspectives with? And how do we also not cast aside the importance and the significance of what somebody else is feeling who may not have the same belief systems we do?
Well, let's talk about what overjoining looks like, right? Overjoining in therapy essentially is when therapists become overly aligned with a client's perspective, particularly on shared beliefs and values. And so this can lead to a therapeutic relationship that actually feels biased or unbalanced. And the therapist can implicitly or explicitly reinforce the client's views without providing any neutral, reflective space for exploration, right? And so overjoining can look like it can be a strong agreement with a client's statements. It can then further the idea that there's a lack of critical exploration because you may not feel the need inherently to do so. If a therapist shares a strong emotional reaction with the client on a particular issue, they can inadvertently escalate the client's emotional state rather than providing a calming and objective presence. And that's a main factor. There's also a reinforcing of an us versus them mentality, which can be really dangerous, obviously, because you're there to calm somebody down and help them gain control of the things they can't, that are not within their immediate control, or at least feel that they have the ability to do so. And if you're self-disclosing on similar beliefs, it can blur the boundaries and create a sense of camaraderie that moves beyond the therapeutic alliance. And where one can see that as being beneficial ethically, it can be quite damaging.
In many aspects of the profession, we strongly identify with social justice causes. I think you'll meet many a clinician who consider themselves a social justice warrior. And the complexity of embodying that while also having a client who has different belief systems than you do. I want to encourage our listeners, if you haven't already, we have a number of podcast episodes that talk about kind of some of these values clashes. There are a number there. The ones that really come to mind for me are the ones featuring Lambers Fisher, because this isn't an easy thing to do. In fact, it's one of the hardest things that we can do clinically. And I have had the experience of community catastrophes where we can all say, where everyone in that community can say that thing that happened or is happening is awful and detrimental and dangerous and horrible. So when I went into session in those environments, my clients were feeling some shade of the same thing that I was. But like, this is totally different because some might be feeling something is awful and some might be feeling something is great. And that asks so much from us. How can we do a better job supporting clients who have different perspectives, remembering that our ethics say that we are there to support the client, and to support their autonomy and not to convince somebody of, quote unquote, the right way to be.
So, well, and in speaking about current events, supporting clients with different political perspectives or values, because it boils down to the foundational ethics that we went to school for. It requires a thoughtful, open approach, and that approach has to center on respect, empathy, and neutrality. Period. There are some strategies for that, to helping clients feel valued, to ensure that we're following ethically what we need to do. And the first part of that, I think, is focusing on understanding, not agreement. Agreement with a client doesn't necessarily get us anywhere, right? So we approach clients' political beliefs with curiosity rather than judgment. And instead of viewing these perspectives through our own lens, we have to know where the client's at and aim to understand what those beliefs mean to the client and how they influence everything from their identity, their values, and of course their experiences. So the other part of that is to ask open-ended questions. When it's appropriate, we ask questions that help the clients explore their beliefs, not how we get to identify with them or align with them, because that's not the point. So I might say one example might be, what about the issues or the issue feels most important to you? How does this view connect with your values or life experiences? What contributes to your feeling of anxiety surrounding this political climate? Right? Asking these kinds of questions is really important, because what I'm modeling for the client is my genuine interest in how these things affect them, not in high-fiving them and say, you know what, I think it's great that you picked so-and-so, and let's talk more about these issues. That's not, aligning isn't helping anybody. Ironically, it's helping the therapist potentially feel better about themselves, which isn't really the point of therapy, is it? So practicing empathy by focusing on underlying emotions, right? And as a trauma therapist, underlying emotions, there's always some reason for something. That's my belief. We identify the emotions behind beliefs. We validate the client experience, not necessarily their belief. We validate their experience. So we reflect on the emotional experience rather than endorsing the viewpoint. So for example, if a client expresses fear or anger related to a political issue, I might say, it sounds like this situation is bringing up a lot of concern for you. So this can help clients feel understood without implying agreement with their political stance. I'm not there to align with them. I'm there to align with their experience and their pain or their concern or their anxiety, not with their belief. And we can challenge the thought to a degree if we're using cognitive behavioral therapy or narrative therapy. We can help them with their narrative. In this particular case, I think some existentialism is good, but I tend to stick to the evidence-based practices, because then I can hold myself accountable as well to make sure that I'm asking the right questions. So, and of course, setting personal boundaries, self-reflection, keeping in mind that I'm there to provide a neutral space, which can sometimes really get lost in these kinds of things, because it does affect each of us at a very human level, indirectly or directly.
Zooming in on that human level, one thing that happens during times like these is the side sorting, what Brene Brown would call side sorting, the us versus them, and the tendency to take the person in front of us, whether that's a client or a neighbor or the person who just got out of the car in the grocery store with that certain bumper sticker that's in opposition to what you believe, to make that person responsible, representative of the pain that you feel. I had a supervisor once that said, as long as I can connect with at least one aspect of a client's humanity, I can do the work. Can you speak a little bit about that kind of grounding, to not be sharing space potentially with somebody who has different beliefs, who's responding differently in these days than we are, and be like, you're the one that is hurting me, that is whatever. Like, we make them like the token that represents all the things. How do we, like, from like a countertransference standpoint, not make somebody like, and that goes on both sides, again, whether you're coming at this as somebody who is neutral in this political climate, if you're coming at it as someone who is highly polarized one way or the other, to not make the client in front of us like responsible for all the things, because I think it's so easy. Like, I had a conversation with a neighbor where it's like, where certain words are coming out, and I was like, whoa, how did like a whole group of people just get like looped in to this one concept?
I think again, for me, it's a Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of thing. It's back to nature, right? Back to the basics, and it's focusing on feelings rather than facts. I'm not there to judge a person's belief system I'm there to acknowledge it, but I'm not there to judge it. I want to try to center the conversation on how they feel about the topics rather than the specific opinion or belief, right? If somebody's going to disparage somebody, say, a candidate that I liked, it's trying to understand where that came from. It's trying to understand the feeling behind it, not the fact that I need to be offended or feel defensive, because then I'm not maintaining a stance of neutrality, right? And that's the difficulty. Again, I'm encouraging exploration. I'm inviting reflection. I may ask them about certain things that help lead them to that opinion. And as we all know, it's the mother or father, always. I'm kidding. But we know that to some extent, we grow up with certain beliefs, and some of those beliefs during formative years are reinforced, and we work our best way. The way I try to do it with political stuff is to acknowledge that it's just another element in this person's life that they're trying to navigate themselves. So I try not to look at it as, this person is, intelligent or unintelligent. I'm not judging the person, right? Just like we do with any client that comes in, we acknowledge that they have courage to walk through the door in the first place, at least from a private practice perspective. But paraphrasing the client's words, helping them understand or hear what they're saying, to see if they notice anything that might be faulty in their thinking or disorganized, or being conscious of language. How are they using the language to describe something? Are we maintaining therapeutic goals? Are these things that need to be changed? Using the client's words and understanding of their world, their schema, to help them understand. Are they saying what they want to be saying? Are they conveying what needs to be conveyed in a way that feels like somebody can follow? I hope I'm saying that. But and again, practicing self-awareness. When the client gets animated, by the way, helping them with grounding techniques, box breathing, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, sensory exercise. And again, I always come back to this, but it's really about separating the emotions from the belief.
I can't appropriately attribute this quote, so I apologize to the quoter. I remember being at a training however many years ago, and the presenter saying that trauma is fundamentally about a loss of power, a loss of ability to influence what's happening. There are many people in the country who are having very real and valid fears about their rights and about the rights of their loved ones. And many clinicians that may be sharing that fear as well. There are some things that we can't CBT our way out of. We can't convince ourselves to feel differently when there is a very real threat. And I also can see how that disconnect could play out in therapy, again, depending on the beliefs and values of the clinician and the worldview and the reality for a particular client and how different those might be. I want to acknowledge those differences. And for our listeners, I really encourage everybody to listen to the episode we did recently with Dr. Sangeetha Prasad, where she was talking about kind of the role of the oppressed and oppressor within all of us and kind of deconstructing some of these power dynamics, because we're bringing that into therapy. It's part of who we are. So I just kind of want to take this sidebar and acknowledge that it is such a big ask of a clinician under any circumstance when we are hurting to put on our clinical fancy hat and take care of somebody else when it may be like the last thing that we want to do right now. How in the world do we do this, Dain? If we are one of those therapists right now who feels gutted and lost, and insert feeling here, how do we take care of ourselves when we also have an obligation to serve?
Well, I'm glad you asked me an easy question. I think that, honestly, on a very personal level, it comes down to grounding. I believe in that mindfulness and grounding, gratitude, forgiveness. These are the elements that essentially bring us back to baseline, right? And I talked about this earlier, but I do think the grounding techniques and breath work, and not to sound cliche or just, it's overplayed, but the science behind it, the research behind these things is evident. And one of the things that, again, for me, one of the best ways that I know, because we're social creatures, so that we're not getting so far into our own minds, I think seeking social and professional support, peer consultation, therapist support groups. There's Facebook groups where you get to ask questions. I know that I talk to a handful of my colleagues just to make sure that I'm on the right page. Stream of conscious writing, I do that. Reflective journaling. Sometimes doing some of the things that are even seeming fads, taking a cold shower or doing a cold plunge. I know for one, I'm an undiagnosed person with undiagnosed ADHD. And so humming or singing or stimming in some way is comforting to me. So sometimes I'll do that. And when you're asking me how to do this in session, obviously we're supporting the client as best we can, but outside of session, these are things that I'm doing. Going for walks, making sure that I travel and get a sense of the world around me, because being in my own closet, so to speak, where I'm surrounded by the same people and similar beliefs and the same neighborhoods and the same whatever, getting outside of my office. If I can go on a walk with a client, sometimes people prefer being outside of the four walls, changing it up, giving myself room to breathe, taking the mental health day, using the sick days that I have, using one of them as a mental health day, regular sleep and nutrition. And it sounds so easy when I say it out loud, and then I go to do that myself tonight, and I'm like, why is it 1 o'clock in the morning? I'm staring at the alarm clock. It's because I'm worried about the same things that everybody else is worried about. And I don't want to sit here and say that just because I know it, I'm good at it. I know a lot of things about caloric intake, and I'm overweight. Sometimes we just don't always know what to do or how to do it. And it's different for everyone. I think some of the best ways that we can do this, and this is, it's surely based in research, but it's also very personal to me, is surrounding myself with people who love and support me. It doesn't mean that they align with me necessarily. It doesn't mean they have to agree with every notion or political stance or opinion. It just means that I'm around people who make me feel good. And it seems so simple, and I'm hoping that people listening have somebody that they can go to. They don't feel that they're a burden to. That they can walk away with, they can have a latte, or they can do something, or they can do something that makes them feel replenished. If you have a sense of adventure, go adventure. If you have a wanderlust, go travel. If you have a desire to eat cotton candy, but also want to maintain low sugars, find an alternate. We'll do something else. But, don't say no to everything. Don't be your first no. If you want something sweet, get something sweet. Within reason, of course. Everything in moderation. If you're missing something, if you don't feel good physically, start out walking 5-10 minutes a day. Sometimes just putting on your shoes can make you feel better, knowing that you're going to head out the door. I realize, again, that some of this is oversimplifying, but some of it really isn't. Some of the simplest answers, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as my practice is concerned, or has been concerned, these have been some of the greatest building blocks to somebody moving forward, including myself, including colleagues that I've watched go be burnt out or have compassion fatigue.
The part I always think about in times like this is like, how am I, if at all, modeling the very things that I might encourage in a client? And I hear myself say, go back to basics. Let's talk about sleep hygiene. Let's talk about what food you're consuming, if you're eating at all. And I think it's really important to normalize that struggle for clinicians. Like, I feel like almost like the first step is to acknowledge that we're like possibly in it. Not all of us, but that some of us are like deeply in it. I call it rolling around in the mud. It's like I am rolling around in the mud. And I'm thinking about what you had said about grounding. My dear colleague Jill Johnson Young, who has come on the podcast a couple of times, and she's an amazing grief therapist. She's talked before about how when she's walking into these sessions that she knows, it's like you can't, like, grief work, we survive with humor. And like we're talking about some really heavy, devastating stuff. And Jill talked about like tactile grounding, about having cold water or tea near her, or the cozy, fluffy blanket I have on my lap as we speak. But kind of the importance for ourselves to ground physically in those moments, because we too may be suffering from nervous system dysregulation, hyperactivity. Our heart rate is up, we're not sleeping well, and trying to kind of regulate that. Can you speak a little bit about those, like, in the moment, like, how am I going to do this right now, thoughts that therapists are
You
having?
mean like right before or during seeing a client? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the first
yeah,
thing,
exactly.
first thing to understand is that with regard to, and I bring it back to COVID, and I bring it back to 2016, 2020, and this week, that we've all, I think to a certain extent, we've all been in this low grade, you know, sympathetic dominance or sympathetic, nervous system arousal. And we're all facing relative trauma, right? I think sometimes acknowledging our, for me, acknowledging our humanness in session can help align with a client to a certain degree, to align with their comfort level, to deepen the relationship. And I don't mean to agree with a client or to say, oh my God, I feel trauma too. Like, oh, you're crying? Let me cry. Like, it's not, obviously it doesn't work that way. But to acknowledge that in the moment, I think sometimes we're left with let me say it like this. We often encourage our clients to communicate their feelings and their emotions. And I have clients who feel badly sometimes because they don't ask me how I'm doing, right? And I'm like, you don't have to worry about me. I'm good. But sometimes I realize they need that human interaction and they need to feel as though they're a part of something. While you take care of their needs, they also kind of want to take care of yours. Why? Because we're social creatures. Because inherently we do this. Because before we're 2 years old, we're handing people part of our food. We're always wanting to share. We're always wanting to give to somebody else in some way or make sure that they're cared for. And then along the way, we learn how to close ourselves off or protect our vulnerability based on our experiences, positive or negative. But I think when somebody comes to therapy, they want genuine connection. And if I can acknowledge with somebody, this week was a tough week. Well, I had a lot of clients and I had some clients that were dealing with some stuff. And I don't say that, I don't say, oh, by the way, I got divorced and I lost a ton of money at the house. It's not that specific, but
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge to some degree that you don't always have to say, I'm doing just fine or I'm doing well. I think depending on your relationship to the client, that may very well be the case. But there are times when I have said to a client, I said, I'll be honest, it's been a tough week, but I'm glad you're here. Let's talk about you. Because I really enjoy the work that we do. And I'm curious to see how your week was. So I can acknowledge it and very simply and gently deflect it as well. But I can also bring them in for just a brief moment. Because I know, at least I feel, that has been a successful strategy for me. And I think, and again, humanizing the anguish that we're experiencing to some degree, regardless of who is, either nominated or elected, or, in terms of the political climate, we're all feeling something. And I want to acknowledge that, we have other things to be concerned about and to look forward to. And at some point, that pressure will normalize like it does to some degree for many people. Right, wrong, or indifferent, everybody's going to experience that a little bit differently. Everybody's going to experience, just as somebody experiences trauma differently. Some people have a larger capacity than others, and it doesn't mean it's any better or worse. It just means they have a different capacity for it based on what they've observed or what was modeled for them. And we have to care for the client in that way, and we have to care for ourselves, and acknowledging that we too carry the pain of other people. And we need to find ways to facilitate that pain in a way that feels that we can sublimate it effectively and do what's necessary for us to get back to our baseline. And I hope I'm answering your question right. There's a myriad ways to do it, and it is completely different for everybody.
I think you've brought up a lot of important considerations, really focusing kind of on our duty to serve and support someone else's autonomy. And I also realize, like anybody who's listening, are we in private practice and we don't have paid time off? So that's not a possibility. Are we in a therapy mill kind of work situation where we have no control over how and when clients are referred to us or whether or not they're a good fit? And it was already burnout city. Recognizing like how diverse our field is and what people are facing in their careers right now, regardless of any of this. And to to what you had said too about kind of like the world outside, putting one foot in front of the other. And I hear Dory from Finding Nemo in my head just keeps swimming. um it's a weird position to be in, that how many times was I in situations where, due to wildfires in Southern California, I was on my hands and knees holding the hands of my child who's scared, and I'm saying, well, we're evacuating, and as long as we and the pets are okay, we're okay. And my heart's like 140 beats a minute, and I'm like, take deep breaths, ground yourself, vagus nerve stimulation. Like that disconnect, I think, is so difficult, and I just kind of want to like acknowledge that. And what I've been thinking about in these times when some of us feel so out of control is like, well, how do I find some sense of control? What is within my sphere of influence? And can I work with that? Because, we saw this happen with COVID, where it's like, I am going to watch all news all the time and just consume as much information about the situation as I can. Can you speak a little bit about like what not to do when we are either in burnout or walking toward it professionally, because of either our personal and or professional lives colliding in such a way that like the water is hot?
Okay. Well, the first thing is, and one of the first things I tell my clients and remind myself to do, is to limit the social media consumption and limit the media consumption altogether. My beautiful, sweet 83-year-old mother is the most diplomatic and sweetest thing I know. But when she talks politics, she's the loudest human being I've ever heard in my entire life. And I said, you watching CNN again? Yeah? Okay. Well, let's go back to Blue Bloods, Mom. Because I want her to, I just, research shows that when we watch too much news, it's geared toward depression. It's geared toward being fear-mongering, right? It's meant to keep us engaged in some way, but it feeds on fear. And the way things are presented, we can analyze things to death. And not all media is good media. And so I encourage people to communicate more directly with one another. I always tell couples, please don't fight over text. Please don't put your personal stuff on social media. It's the same thing. With regard to the political climate, I mean, acknowledging that we're already I think we're already in a very cynical point in our, I don't know if I want to call it generation or point in the sociopolitical culture, the sociopolitical nature of things that are going on, or the sociocultural nature of things, the divisiveness. And it's what I encourage people to do with regard to burnout is find more connection where they can. I could go into the research of it. I could tell you all the things. Um, I could give you and pontificate about 93 different articles that suggest all this. But at the end of the day, it's about getting back to nature. It's about going on a hike. It's about connecting with a person you really adore. It's about finding gratitude in the things that are present in your life, not worrying about the things you cannot control. We have to be more aligned with our coping mechanisms and the idea that we have control over how we respond to a situation versus how we can control a situation. And I think that's where a lot of the anxiety and the frustration comes in right now, is that people don't feel, and just like with COVID, people felt they were out of their minds because they didn't feel like they were in control of anything, which wasn't necessarily true. However, we can all understand the nature of not feeling safe, not feeling secure, not feeling powerful in things we once felt that we had relative power. Reminding people that on any given day, the thing that separates us from oncoming traffic is 6 inches of yellow paint. That's it. And again, we think we're in so much control of things when we're not. And what we can control is how we respond, not react, but how we respond. That we don't have to yell, that my mom doesn't have to yell about something that she's passionate about, even though I understand it as passion. I can also say, Mom, the telephone is a device that's meant for me to hear you in the first place. You know, and so I joke with her, and I plead and I begged with her for the last decade, please stop watching the media the way you do. And I encourage people to do the same. I want people to feel a sense of security. And you know what? When I'm walking in nature, and I've had other people do that, you get a different feel for your neighborhood. You're not just driving through it. You're not simply idly passing by things at 30 some miles an hour. I encourage people to talk to one another. I encourage people to take a breath. I encourage people to look around. I think those things are extremely important. I think those are the things that it sounds, and here's the problem. It sounds so utterly cheesy when I say it like that. And it sounds so cliche. And I said this earlier, but it's also the simplest things that if we really do invest in them, they bring us back to a sense of self. And I think that's the most important thing. And I take on the pain of other people all day, every day, just as you do and just as any of the listeners, might be doing. Whether we're in customer service or we're therapists, we take on the pain and the frustration and the anxiety of other people, and we do our best to deflect it. I don't have Wonder Woman silver bracelets, but God, I wish I did. And there are times that I try to remember that this person's pain is temporary. I like to believe that it's moments of temporariness that may be in consecutive days, but on some level, my hope is that that person has the ability to challenge the perspective they have, if only to see the perspective in another. And not to say who's right or wrong, but to say, I can acknowledge it. We can agree to disagree. Because I think that's the nature of loving somebody. That's the nature of what it means to be caring, compassionate, considerate. And I think that's what's been missing for us. And especially since COVID, we've been challenged as a society to be better for one another, to be better to one another. I mean, I don't mean to pontificate again like soapbox, but I think it boils down to us having more confidence in our ability to move through the things that make us feel powerless.
When we look at those sociopolitical things that make us feel powerless, there are some concepts that bubble to the surface in the research about connection, talking with people, potentially advocacy, the value in these things, and how self-protective they can be. I will show my cards that my invitation for Dain is not entirely altruistic because hello, I just got an hour to consult with a colleague who's a specialist on burnout. Um, can you speak a bit about, ideas like supervision and group consultation and our own coping. And like, I'm in a women's group that meets every week. And let me tell you, I am glad that that's on my calendar. And I am grateful to have a number of clinicians in my daily life, because there is something different about holding the pain and witnessing the pain and fear of someone in your day to day for your job than other professions. And so I think it can be easy for clinicians to feel like, but you don't get it. Like you don't get the gravity of what I'm seeing right now and what I'm feeling and what I'm holding. Because I know a lot of people, I think, when we are faced with like something that feels so overwhelming, it's like, I want to just climb into my little cave and I'm going to hide, I'm going to curl up in a ball, and I'm not going to talk to anybody, and everybody leave me alone.
Yeah, I get that. There are a ton of therapist resources on Facebook. I also tend to follow other therapists on Instagram, because some of the messages it's interesting because some of the things that they're reminding clients to do, or people, it's like I take on that same understanding for myself. I have to remind myself of these things. I encourage regular reflective practice for people. Again, journaling, supervision. Because I'm in private practice, I have the fortune of not having to do a lot of consulting or supervision because I'm licensed. But I also have the misfortune of not having that. And so I make sure that I have a rotation of at least 6 to 10 people that I talk to about cases. Am I looking at this the right way? Hey, how are you doing? And I'll decompress. So sometimes the supervision, for me, the supervision and or the consultations with other therapists is really, how are you doing? Decompressing with them. It's not just about cases, but acknowledging how they're holding themselves accountable. And for me, peer consultation has been a lifeline to me, not winding up more depressed or more anxious. Because again, taking on the pain of other people requires a significant amount of releasing of the pressure of that steam that builds up, right? And emphasizing supervision, peer consultation, it offers external perspectives. It gives me a chance to be more balanced. And a lot of times I want to surround myself with people who aren't afraid to tell me what they need to tell me. I don't want just to align with people that are in supervision or peer consultations. I need to hear it. I need to be open to constructive criticism. I need to know that my greatest asset as a clinician is that I might not be the best fit for everybody. I need to remind myself, and in certain times, I need to check my ego at the door as well and say, maybe this doesn't work. So, we're holding hope. We're reminding ourselves that we're able to allow even just one person to be seen, heard, and supported. And if I can go on that, I know that it's not my job to save everybody. I remind myself that it's my job to provide perspective and hope. And that if I can do that effectively, then they can do for themselves. Then I've done what I was supposed to do. And at the end of the day, I take 3 deep breaths after I get off the phone before I do anything. And I make sure that I'm absolutely cognizant and conscientious of what I'm doing, so that I take those 3 deep breaths and try to separate my day as best I can. And then I see if I can take a walk, or I see if I can watch some ridiculous reality show that takes me away, that is, a guilty pleasure. Or I'll give myself that time, that 15 minutes, that half an hour, that 45 or an hour that I need, or even the rest of the evening. Sometimes you just want to get under a blanket, watch a movie, or plan your next trip.
In trying to think about the last hour that we've spent together, Dr. Kloner, one of the things that stands out to me is about intentionality. Not just a clinician's intention with a client, but also a clinician's intentionality with themselves, to have compassion or grace for where we are, for the inherent biases that we more than likely have, and then also using reflection and intentionality to center ourselves and remember why we're doing what we're doing. Because for some, this can feel so groundless, and we need something to like kind of hold on to. One thing I want to share that occurred to me while you were talking, I have a colleague who's highly sensitive, and he and I were talking about, what it means to be highly sensitive. And he said, when I'm in a session with a client and there's just so much intensity, he's like, I know it's small and maybe it feels silly. He's like, but I take one of my hands and my arms and I wrap it over my abdomen. And it's my way of acknowledging my body and what my experience in the room is, and kind of letting it also like bounce off of me sometimes, because I think when we are in these really charged, intense environments, we can absorb so much and that burns us out. And it's hard for us to remember the separation between self and other, because there can be so much pain and so much fear. And you talked about it a little bit earlier, but kind of this remembrance of like, why are we here? And also like not overjoining and not casting aside, but trying to walk this line to adhere to the goals of our profession.
I wanted to address that. I am curious, because I don't know if your listeners know what you do, and I'm curious what you do to kind of facilitate that back to baseline for you when you take on the pain of other people.
I actually have a very simple thing that I imagine, and I don't know when it started. I've been doing it for a long time. I imagine like a cloak that I put on. And in session, I'm able to hold that cloak, and it's the client's cloak. I'm able to feel it, whether it's cold or warm or sharp or whatever it is. And then at the end of session, I visualize taking the cloak off and hanging it up
That's very
on a
cool.
coat rack. Like that's kind of my visualization of like, I'm here with you in this. And the way that I try to remember what's mine and what's not. And that's where I think we can get really muddy when there is so much intensity and so much pain. And it's where we get dysregulated.
I agree. Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for asking. We've covered so much in this hour. Is there anything else, Dr. Kloner, that you want to leave our listeners with? Because we are in some trying times. And actually, I have one other thing I want to leave listeners with. Humor.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm hearing us in this conversation, and there's like these little like nuggets of weird, quirky humor, and it's like, is that welcome here? And it's like, I don't know any other way.
I mean, the four things that really bring us back to baseline: humor, mindfulness, forgiveness, and gratitude. And I think learning to let go, via forgiveness of relative pain, knowing that we can forgive ourselves for not knowing what we know now, finding humor in situations. I grew up in a home where, my mom always said you can laugh or cry. We chose to laugh. And then of course mindfulness, doing box breathing, doing deep breath work, progressive muscle relaxation. All of these things are legitimately proven to work. So I recommend that. And I think humor above all else. My mom always says, she's like, if you're not laughing, you're already dead. And I don't think she's wrong. And I think that you have to know pain to know how to laugh at it or to laugh through it. And I think we do enough pain, but we don't often give ourselves enough time or credit to invest in the humor. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's really, really important. Guy walks into a psychiatrist's office wearing nothing but cellophane underwear. The doctor looks him up and down. He says, I can clearly see your nuts. I love that joke. It's a great joke. I'm just throwing it out there. It's a party joke. I do want some credit. No, I'm kidding. But I love that. I tell my clients all the time, and my slogan in my therapy is, it's only therapy. And I do that because I don't ever want and I don't mean to minimize anybody's trauma or ordeal, but I also want them to know that they can talk about their ordeal in a way that, over time at least, doesn't have to take away from ultimately who they are, who they want to become. And I live by that. So while I may not always get the most sleep that I need or work out as often as I would like, I definitely do use humor. I use it to deflect in my own life, but I also use it to make sure that people know that they're cared for. Because for me, it's the biggest way to build rapport and ultimately to sustain relationships. Therapeutically, at least for me, it's worked, especially in trauma.
Before we had started recording, Dain, you'd mentioned kind of the human aspect of healing. And I'm recalling the conversation that I had with Dr. Irv Yalom a couple years ago about, the way that a wounded healer heals, and that we're as much present for therapy, at least I hope so. We're as much present for therapy as our clients are. And one of the things that you had said was kind of, if we're in person, concepts around touch, the power of when someone is really, clinical term here, but really dysregulated, probably for very good reason. The power of saying, I feel like I would really like to hold your hand right now. Is that okay? Or, can I come sit next to you on the couch? And I know for me, working primarily virtually, for me, it's putting my hands on my heart and even potentially inviting a client to do the same. It's like but it's much more significant than like air hug. Um, but I think like kind of this idea of our humanity in the room and that being foundational to the work, because we can get so stuck in the content.
The black and white of it. Yeah. I, Sorry, I was just going to piggyback on what you were saying. And I think I'm more like Satyrian in the sense that, Virginia Satir was big on hugs or reaching out, holding somebody's hand or putting her hand on their leg. I don't do that, but I mean, I get it. And I think asking somebody, and I'm aware of the male female dynamic, of course, and the, people's comfort level. And most of the work I do is virtual anyway, but acknowledging with them, like you said, putting your hand over your heart, and saying, listen, I just want you to know, if it's okay, I'm sending you a hug, or I just want you to know that I'm right next to you and I'm here if you need. I think that those things are in essence okay. I mean, of course, I say that you have to know your client, you have to understand the boundaries and the level of comfort. But I do think that in times where things are really difficult, to acknowledge that you're there physically for somebody, I think is important. It increases the levels of vasopressin, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. It's it's proven. And so I think sometimes just acknowledging that is important. Asking somebody about their favorite movie increases serotonin by 29%. Telling somebody that they've done a good job and looking them in the eyes and making eye contact can increase productivity in a worker by as much as 31%. I mean, the research is there. I think so. Being heard, being seen, being valued. One of the ways that we can do that is by acknowledging, at least to some degree, of physicality. Again, making very sure and aware, or making that other person aware that it is in a professional way and that it's designed solely for the comfort of that client, and adds, I'd say, an extra level of warmth in somebody's need of comfort. That's all, as long as it's done appropriately, and with the consent of somebody or the understanding of that, the nature of that relationship.
Thank you for this conversation, Dain.
Thank you for having it. Thank you for asking me to do it. I think it's important. I really do. When you reached out, I got back to you within 14 minutes. So I was, I was on board for sure.
I am grateful for friends and colleagues in high places. For folks who want to learn more about you, Dain, and about your work, what's the best way to do that?
They can, two ways. One, they can go to my website, which is dainkloner.com, DAINKLONER.com. And my phone number's on there. It's my personal cell. And that's probably the best way to do so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kloner. It's always lovely to have you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good to be here.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.